for 7 minutes to introduce himself and to say what he wants to say before we get going.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organisers for putting this on. I'm not a politician. I'm a scientist and a doctor, and I have to apologise in advance if what I say is less professional and less polished than what the esteemed rest of the panel will be able to come up with. I should say, by way of disclaimer, I don't myself get any funding from the EU. Would as I did, but I don't. All of my funding comes from the Medical Research Council, so I don't have any sort of direct personal interest in this. I do obviously have an interest, though, from the point of view of being a scientist. Is this working?
Yeah.
I do have an interest from the point of view of being a scientist because the UK does tremendously well out of EU membership for its scientific research. We get a lot more money out of it than we put in, so those sort of crude terms, we do well. But it's also important to analyse why it is that we do well. We're talking about a fairly substantial sum of money. It's up to 8% of the EU's total budget now is allocated for scientific research to be allocated to universities. And it funds about 15% of the research funding in Cambridge University. And the reason we do well is that successive governments, and I think particularly it's Chris Patten and then subsequently Lord Sainsbury, managed to argue, first of all, that the EU should increase the size of its science budget, because investing in science is very good from the point of view of the economy, for everyone in Europe. And secondly, they were very successful in arguing that the way in which those funds should be allocated was on the basis of scientific excellence. And that suits the UK rather well, because we are a science superpower within the EU, and we therefore draw a disproportionate amount of that funding. It's not just on the funding, though, that the EU sort of does well for Britain. It also enables collaboration and cooperation across Europe, and international research in topics where it's very difficult to conduct that on just a single country basis. Many projects in scientific research now require very large collaborations, and the EU helps very specifically with that. And it also helps very much that we have free movement of individuals, because it allows us to attract the best talent from across the EU and recruit them to our research programmes. So the EU is acknowledged, I think, to be excellent for the UK in terms of scientific research. And this is why those in the Brexit camp would like to retain that. They would like us to stay in those European research networks. Now this is where you have a problem, because you've got, broadly speaking, two ways of doing this. Either you accept free movement of people, free movement of goods, and free movement of services, if you like, the sort of relationship that Norway has with the EU. And that would allow you to buy into all of those research networks, and we could probably still do quite well out of that. But of course, all we'd have done then is lose all of that influence that we had over the process in the first place, that influence that was actually incredibly important in securing us those funds. Or you could go down, if you like, the Swiss model, which is to say we're not going to accept free movement of people. And the Swiss, they've actually moved on this quite recently, and they've been doing tremendously badly subsequently out of the EU research funding. They're down to, for example, I think 0.3% of all the projects are now being coordinated in Switzerland, which for a sort of big science nation like Switzerland is a real problem. So this is the dilemma you have. You either lose that British influence, or you damage British science, British scientific research and infrastructure. Now this is actually a microcosm of the whole debate, because it's not just science that we lose out on if we left the EU. We'd have a choice of what to do with trade, and that is vastly, vastly important to the UK's economy. We either go down the route of saying, okay, we're going to do things just as they were before, but we have no influence. That doesn't seem to make any sense. Or we go down the route of really damaging our economy, damaging our scientific infrastructure. And that's why I think at a pragmatic level, Brexit simply does not work, it cannot work for Britain. Do I have any longer?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Well, I think in those 2 minutes, I think pragmatically Brexit's a crazy idea. You know, there's no nice way of putting it. When you think more sort of long term, more strategically, the EU was one of those institutions that had its sort of origins in the horror of the Second World War. It's now become, of course, totally unthinkable that we would go to war with any other European But I think we need to think very carefully about what exiting the EU would actually mean in terms of not military conflicts. I think that's a ludicrous sort of thing to suppose, but the way in which we collaborate and cooperate with other nations in Europe. I think that would very seriously damage our relationship with our EU partners. And of course, it's not just that everyone else in the rest of the world is telling us that we should get out of Europe either. So I think it will damage Britain's standing internationally, and of course then would put us in a very difficult position when we're trying to, disentangle our relationship with Europe and needing to undergo these very complex negotiations with essentially no support. So I think I'll leave it there. And there we go. And,
thank you very much.